So 75 years of NATO. That's quite a legacy to unpack.
It really is. And, with everything going on in the world right now, the timing,
Yeah.
it's uncanny, almost like we're living through,
Oh, for sure.
a sequel to the Cold War, but with even higher stakes this time.
Yeah, and you've brought just the thing to help us unpack it all, right?
Well, I brought excerpts from this new book by Peter Apps.
Okay.
It's called NU Deterring Armageddon.
Okay.
And it's a biography of NATO.
A biography, so not just a dry history lesson then.
No, not at all. This is about understanding how this alliance, forged in the ashes of World War II, is navigating a world that seems to be on the brink of, potential Armageddon.
Heavy stuff. So where do we even begin?
Well, I think the best place to start is with the question that NATO itself is grappling with even now, 75 years later.
Okay.
How do you prevent another devastating war in Europe?
Right, because it's not like that threat ever really went away, did it? I mean, it just morphed into something else.
It became more complex, more players, more unpredictable.
Right, like instead of just staring down one superpower, it's more like a multiplayer chess match where the rules keep changing.
100%.
Okay, but before we get ahead of ourselves, let's rewind the clock.
Okay.
Back to 1946. Picture Europe, it's the dead of winter. They're just starting to rebuild from the war.
Right.
And already there's this new threat looming, the Soviet Union. I mean, they must have felt like they were trapped in this never-ending cycle of conflict.
The exhaustion, the fear, this sense that peace was this fragile thing that could just shatter at any moment.
So that's where the idea for NATO comes from, this
is
desperate need for some kind of collective security.
Yes.
Like they realized a divided Europe just wouldn't stand a chance against Soviet expansion.
Exactly. They had to present a united front.
So more than just a military alliance then, it was a statement, like drawing a line in the sand and saying,
absolutely,
this far and no further.
100%. And, a key figure in all of this, in forging that unity, was Ernest Bevin. He was Britain's foreign secretary at the time.
Not a name you hear as often as like a Churchill or a Stalin.
No, but a very important figure.
Okay.
He was a pragmatic guy, a powerhouse, really. And he understood that only a united front could stand up to the Soviets.
So he was really the driving force behind the North Atlantic Treaty then.
He was the driving force behind it, yeah.
Which brings us to 1949.
There you go.
The year NATO was officially born. I mean, we all read about this in our history books, but I'm curious, did it really change the game? Did Stalin just back down after that?
Well, it definitely complicated his calculations. See, the treaty had this core principle.
Yeah.
An attack on one is an attack on all.
Right.
That sent a very clear message to Moscow.
Okay, so they're on edge. But then, just a few years later, you have the Korean War. And I know it was geographically distant, but I'm guessing it still
enough ripple effects.
Really shook things up for NATO.
It sent shockwaves through the alliance. Suddenly, it wasn't a hypothetical threat anymore. It was a real conflict.
And I'm guessing it raised some serious doubts about whether the U.S. would actually risk
absolutely,
a nuclear war with the Soviets if one of these smaller European countries got attacked.
Exactly. And that question about the U.S.'s commitment to defending Europe.
Yeah.
That becomes a recurring theme.
Yeah, you can see why.
Throughout NATO's entire history.
Wow, so they're dealing with all that, and then on top of it, they have to figure out how to function as an alliance, right? Yeah. I mean, it's one thing to agree on paper that you're all on the same side, but trying to get all those different countries with different languages and histories...
Oh, tell you about it.
...to actually agree on anything, I mean...
It's like herding cats.
That's what I imagine.
Yeah, it really is. Even with a common enemy, there are always internal disagreements.
Right.
Competing interests.
Sure. Makes sense.
It's just the nature of it.
Okay, so let's dig into some of those disagreements. The book mentions the Berlin crisis, which, I mean, talk about a moment where it felt like...
It really was.
Things could have gone very, very wrong.
Could have gone nuclear in a heartbeat.
Exactly. And what's fascinating to me is that it wasn't just a standoff between NATO and the Soviet Union.
Right.
You also had disagreements within NATO about how to handle the situation.
Absolutely.
Like the book mentions a clash between Sassier Norstad and
U.S. Defense Secretary McNamara.
Hold on. Remind me who Sassier is again.
Right, sorry. Sassier stands for Supreme Allied Commander, Europe. Basically, it's the top military leader for all of NATO's forces.
Okay, so you've got Norstad, the military guy, pushing for a hard line against the Soviets.
Right.
And then you've got McNamara back in Washington, urging caution, worried about escalating things.
Worried about starting a war, yeah.
Man, talk about a pressure cooker.
Intense.
The weight of the free world on your shoulders, and you can't even agree on what to do.
Exactly.
And then a few years after that, you have the Cuban Missile Crisis, which, I mean, that makes the Berlin Crisis look like...
Oh, child's play.
Exactly.
Small potatoes.
Right.
Yeah, and that one really tested NATO's solidarity.
Yeah, because even though it was mainly between the U.S. and the Soviets, I imagine...
Oh, the stakes were incredibly high.
Yeah.
For everyone, especially in Europe.
Right, of course.
They were going to be the ones on the front lines.
And what does App say about how it was handled with NATO? I mean...
Well, he argues that Kennedy's decision to only loop in NATO allies at the last minute
Oh, wow.
really revealed a lack of trust there.
Interesting.
Yeah, some members felt like they'd been left in the dark.
Which, yeah, I mean, I can see how...
Which fueled existing anxieties.
Just make those anxieties even worse.
About the U.S.'s commitment to their security.
Right, like, are you with us or not?
Exactly.
You've got all that tension, you know, trust issues, the threat of nuclear annihilation, and then the Berlin Wall just comes down.
You'd think that would be it for NATO, right?
You'd think so, yeah.
Like, mission accomplished, everybody go home.
Exactly. But it doesn't work out that way.
No, instead they have this existential crisis. It's like, what purpose does a Cold War alliance even serve in a world without the Cold War?
Right, because it's not like the threat completely vanished.
No.
I mean, the Soviet Union was gone, but Russia was still there.
Still there, figuring out its next move.
Exactly. And I'm guessing for a lot of those Eastern European countries that had just gotten out from under Soviet control, the idea of having Russia as a neighbor...
Oh, yeah.
Probably wasn't all that comforting.
Not exactly reassuring, no.
So naturally, they start looking to NATO for some kind of protection.
Right, they wanted in on that security guarantee.
Which is kind of wild when you think about it. Like, just a few years ago...
I know.
These were the guys on the other side of the Iron Curtain.
Exactly. But that's how quickly things were changing.
Yeah.
The old enemy becomes the new protector.
And that's where things get really interesting, because this whole expansion of NATO eastward, it was welcomed by some, but for others, it was seen as a huge provocation.
Especially for Russia.
Right. Like, imagine how you'd feel if the shoe was on the other foot.
Exactly. One man's security guarantee is another man's encroachment.
Right.
And this is something Abs argues very clearly in the book.
Okay.
He says this eastward expansion, while it made sense at the time, it planted the seeds for a lot of the tension we see today between Russia and the West.
Like, almost inevitable, in a way.
In a way.
Wow, so we've gone from deterring tanks to this whole other level of geopolitical chess.
Right.
But wait, there's more.
Oh, there's always more.
Because then you have the wars in the Balkans, which, I mean, talk about a curveball. Nobody was expecting that.
Nobody.
And for NATO, this was a whole new set of challenges.
Absolutely. For one thing, it was a brutal reminder that conflict didn't just disappear with the Cold War.
Right.
And for another, it was happening right on Europe's doorstep.
Exactly. This wasn't some abstract threat. This was people they knew. So how did they even begin to process that? I mean, it raised all these questions about what NATO's role even was anymore, you know?
Absolutely. Like, are we just here to protect members from outside attacks?
Right.
Or do we have a responsibility to intervene in these humanitarian crises?
Right. Even if it means getting involved in these messy civil wars where there's no easy answers.
And that's exactly what you see with the Kosovo intervention.
Yeah, the book really gets into that.
It's a perfect example of this dilemma. I mean, on the one hand, you have this terrible ethnic cleansing happening.
Right.
But on the other hand, there's a real danger of making things worse by intervening.
And then there's the whole issue of civilian casualties during the bombing campaign, which still controversial to this day.
Usually controversial.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even when you're trying to do the right thing, there are always consequences.
Always a price to pay. And it continues to shape how NATO thinks about intervention to this day.
So they're trying to figure out this whole new world order, and then, as if things couldn't get any more complicated,
Russia, under Putin, starts to flex its muscles again.
Yeah, feeling threatened.
And suddenly, it feels like we're right back where we started.
Back to the future.
Right. With Russia making power grabs like the annexation of Crimea in 2014.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the war in Ukraine, Which is still going on.
Which changes everything.
It really does. And suddenly, that whole debate about whether NATO was even relevant anymore just seems almost absurd.
Like a lifetime ago.
Because here we are on the brink of another major conflict in Europe, and guess who's right there at the center of it all?
NATO. Right back where they started.
Only this time, it's not just about tanks and troops on the ground, right?
Oh, no, it's a whole new ballgame.
It's cyber warfare, it's disinformation campaigns, it's the economic pressure, all these things that Russia's using.
All these new tools of war.
Exactly. And NATO's got to figure out how to fight back on all these different fronts.
It's a whole new era of conflict. It's like they barely had time to catch their breath after the Cold War, and now they're facing this whole new era of global tension.
And they have to figure it all out in the blink of an eye.
Yeah, like talk about pressure. Especially with everything else going on within NATO, like who's even going to lead them into this uncertain future? Stoltenberg's on his way out.
He is.
And from what I hear, finding a replacement is no easy task.
Oh, Apps makes the case that the Secretary General is really the glue that holds the whole alliance together.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about wrangling 29 different countries, each with their own priorities and anxieties, and somehow forging a cohesive strategy out of all of that.
It's easier said than done.
Oh, yeah. Herding cats, but the cats have nuclear weapons this time.
Exactly. So has Apps heard any whispers about possible candidates? What are we thinking?
Well, there's a lot of talk about it needing to be a woman this time, which would be huge for NATO.
It would be about time, right?
It's 2024.
Exactly. But I'm guessing it's not just about optics, right? There are some seriously qualified women in the running. Like, what about Ursula von der Leyen? I mean,
she's the current European Commission president.
Right, exactly.
She's definitely a strong contender.
And she has been pretty vocal, hasn't she, about
taking
a tougher stance against Russia.
100%. She's been pushing for a much stronger, more unified European defense posture.
Which, I mean, makes sense, given the current circumstances.
Absolutely. But, you know, it raises the question of the U.S.'s role. I mean, if a European leader takes the helm...
Right. How would that shift the balance of power? Would the U.S. even be okay with taking a back seat?
That is the million-dollar question. I mean, on the one hand, the U.S. has been pushing for Europe to step up for years now. But on the other hand, there's always been this understanding that the U.S. is calling the shots.
Right. Like they're the big dog.
Exactly. And that assumption is being tested like never before.
Especially now that the U.S. has its hands full with,
Oh, absolutely, with China.
The whole China situation.
100%.
It does make you wonder, are they really going to be there for their NATO allies if things get really bad in Europe?
It's a question a lot of people are asking, especially those countries on NATO's eastern flank.
Right, the ones who are closest to Russia.
Exactly. They need to know that the U.S. has their back. But then you hear talk of pulling troops out of Europe to focus on the Pacific.
Right. Talk about mixed signals. So what's the solution? What did Apps say?
Well, he argues that NATO needs to focus on two main things.
Okay.
First, burden sharing. Those European countries have got to step up and start paying their fair share.
Which, good luck getting them to do that.
I know, right? But then his second point is that NATO has to evolve.
What do you mean?
It can't just be about tanks and troops anymore. It's got to be able to respond to all these other threats. Cyber attacks, propaganda, economic warfare, all the things we were just talking about.
So they have to become more agile, more adaptable.
Exactly. It's not enough to just react after the fact.
Wow. So we've gone from this alliance formed to prevent another world war to this global, multifaceted, I don't even know what to call it.
It's a security blanket.
Yeah. It's a security blanket for the 21st century.
That's a great way to put it.
It's amazing to think that an organization like NATO has not only survived for 75 years.
I know, right?
But it's actually more relevant now than ever.
It's a testament to the power of alliances. That when push comes to shove, we're all stronger together than we are apart.
Absolutely. This whole deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. Thanks for bringing in the book and walking us through it all.
Oh, of course. My pleasure.
It's really given us a lot to think about, and I think it just goes to show that the choices we make today, they really do have consequences, and the future of NATO, it's not just some abstract thing, it affects all of us.
100%.
So thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.